Hello and welcome to this discussion about the Arab-Israel relationship vis-a-vis the historic UAE-Israel deal that has happened in recent past. And we are going to look at and understand the entire region, its ramifications on the Arab world, its ramifications in West Asia, as well as outside the region with Ambassador Navdeep Suri, who knows this region, who's been our ambassador in UAE and Egypt. So there's no one better really other than you to explain and how will it really impact India also. With this deal, UAE has just become the third Arab world to normalize relationship with Israel. Egypt and Jordan already had normal relationships earlier. But this is going to impact many other Arab countries and probably could set the stage for a normalization of relationship with other Arab countries and Israel. It is being viewed as a betrayal, as a painful betrayal by some like Iran, while America is flaunting it. President Trump has been calling it a major diplomatic victory. So to begin with, just to understand, we know that UAE and Israel has had relationships, but they've been basically not so open. Now, this signals a change in the Arab world, and how will this deal affect the entire region? This doesn't come as a surprise to someone like you who knows the region, who's been following the region, because, you know, there has, or the two countries, UAE and Israel, had already decided to fight COVID-19 together in June. But now that the relationship is out in the open, how did this really materialize? The backdoor diplomacy, the role of US in it?
Well, thank you, Naghma. I think it's an important topic, and you've raised a lot of different aspects of it. There's the regional dimension, there's the US dimension, there's the India dimension, there's the Palestinian dimension, and I guess we can take each of those and try and unpack them. Look, for those of us who were in the region, the question of UAE normalizing relations with Israel was perhaps a case of not if, but when. Because there were enough signals emerging over the last 3 or 4 years that something was afoot. Most recently, I think when I was in Abu Dhabi, we saw that an Israeli minister for youth and sports had come for a fairly minor judo tournament. And the Israeli judo player won, and for the first time, the Israeli national anthem was played in the stadium in Abu Dhabi. And then the minister herself was taken to the Grand Mosque of Sheikh Zayed in Abu Dhabi on an escorted visit with officials, and actually wrote in the visitors book in Hebrew. And what got my attention wasn't the fact that that happened, but the fact that the local papers reported it in the way they did, which meant to me that UAE was no longer shy about revealing its contacts with a senior Israeli government official. Because previously, what many of us in the diplomatic community were aware of was that there were covert contacts. The Mossad chiefs would come, there would be an excellent security relationship, there was a shared interest in combating Islamic radicalization and terrorism and so on. And so there was a lot that was going on. There was a shared antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a shared antipathy towards Iran in particular. And certainly we saw some of the contacts between UAE and Israel intensify once the Obama administration did that Iran nuclear agreement. And the Emiratis were deeply skeptical about it because they felt very strongly that while it addresses the issue of Iran's nuclear program, it does nothing to restrain Iran's ambitions in the region in terms of its interference through the Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon, and its intervention through the Houthis in Yemen. So there was this real fear that the Iranians are trying to create this so-called Shia crescent, which would encircle the Sunni regimes of UAE, of Saudi Arabia and others. So you could see that those elements were very much at work. But yet, I think the timing of this agreement is a big deal, and it has a significance of its own. That why did it
Yes.
happen now? And I think we can talk separately about that.
Absolutely, I would come to that. But when we talk of Iran, I also want to understand, do you think it is going to sharpen the divide between the Sunni and the Shia countries in the region? Iran, we know that a lot of these countries have antipathy, a shared antipathy towards Iran. Now, we see Saudi Arabia and UAE and a couple of other countries more aligned towards the United States, whereas United States views Iran as its biggest threat these days. So does it sharpen that divide? Do you see this as also a Shia-Sunni conflict? Because there's also a third factor emerging very strongly, that's Turkey.
Yeah, look, there is no doubt that the Turkey and Iran, along with Qatar to a certain extent, are positioning themselves as the bastions of the Muslim causes, as the vanguard of resistance for the Palestinians and all of that. I don't know how much traction it has, and I'd be careful of putting the Sunni Shia construct, because Turkey is very Sunni and Iran obviously is quite Shia. I wouldn't read too much into that particular marriage at this point of time. I think that from the perspective of the Emiratis certainly, and the Saudis to a lesser extent, they have no interest in provoking Iran. We saw this happen last year when you had a lot of tension in the Gulf region. You had the Americans there in strength. You had attacks on shipping in Ras Al Khaimah and elsewhere. And although Iranians never quite admitted the responsibility, but I think the fingerprints were clear that this was a message being sent out, that we have tools at our disposal. And one of the things that came out at that time during the tensions was the active Emirati role to play down the incidents, even though they were very serious as a threat to merchant shipping. And I think the Emiratis recognize that while they have a strong interest in controlling Iran's nuclear ambitions, or indeed Iran's interventions in the Arab world, but they are just across the straits. And should the political tension spill over into a military conflict, cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, which have built their reputation and their grandeur on the illusion of political stability, would be the biggest losers should there be an armed conflict. And I think that sense of vulnerability drove this particular rationale that yes, we want to control Iran's ambitions, but we don't want an outright conflict in which we could also get burnt.
Okay, but you know, the earlier deals that the Arab world has had with Israel, talking about the Egypt-Israel treaty, the Jordanian-Israel treaty, they all had the Palestinian angle to it. They all talked of Palestine. This is different. It does not talk of Palestine at all. So what's in it for Palestine? And we know that Palestine is quite hurt, but how will that change? We know that there has been the annexation has been halted. Different leaders have used different words for it. What is in it for Palestine?
Yeah, so I would disagree that there isn't a Palestinian dimension, because there is. The announcements that came out simultaneously from Washington, D.C., Tel Aviv, and Abu Dhabi had two aspects. One was that Israel had agreed to suspend, stop temporarily stop its plans to annex key parts of the West Bank under the so-called Trump vision for peace and prosperity in the Middle East.
Yes.
And the second dimension was about the normalization of relationships between UAE and Israel. So I think when the Palestinians said that they were betrayed by the Emiratis and of course by the Americans, the Palestinian fear and anger was understandable. And the Emiratis seem to go out of their way to say that, look, there was a ticking time bomb. Dr. Anwar Gargash, the UAE Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, made those comments of annexation. And through our intervention, we have been able to forestall that and hopefully open the way for peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Look, I have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians. They really are between a rock and a hard place. Over the years, we have seen that most countries have paid lip service to the Palestinian cause. Some have written checks when things became particularly dire. But, you know, you also have to recognize that the Palestinians haven't helped themselves through fissures within the Palestinian community between Hamas and its activities in Gaza, and of course, the relatively weak administration that we've seen in the West Bank itself. There have been missed opportunities. I think there were multiple times in the past when the Palestinians could have secured a much better deal than this moth-eaten kind of a Palestinian state that is being talked about now, which is riddled with Jewish settlements right across the West Bank. And I think that's why some of the thinking, and I know this is very early days and it's probably going to be very controversial, but I think that while many countries, including India, will continue to pay lip service to the notion of a two-state solution, where an independent Palestinian state stands side by side with Israel, in practical terms, that dream is receding with every passing year. There are realities on the ground which go against that dream of an independent Palestinian state, which can be viable. And that's why some sensible people now in Palestine itself have started saying, hey, aren't we better off if we fought for equal rights within one single state? And I know that's still some time away from reality. I don't think the Israeli right wing is ready to give equal rights to the Palestinians, but at least it's a different track of conversation, and we have to see how, where exactly that leads.
So what has happened now? Do you think, like you say, the American dream or Trump's dream of peace and prosperity, or at least the promise of peace and prosperity in this region, is this a step forward towards that? Because look at the, you know, he can wave this deal as his achievement, like he's been calling it a major diplomatic achievement in front of especially the very influential Jewish community, and the timing just before the conventions, both the the Republican and Democratic Party convention, it was announced in America just before that, or at the eve of that. So this is going to, like Iran has accused, this is going to help Trump's candidature. So the timing, what would you call, how would you analyze that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that it's no coincidence that the deals announced in Washington to the full court of press and everybody on August 13. The Democratic convention is the next week, and the Republican convention is happening now this week. And certainly it gives Trump an important foreign policy triumph to be able to wave something in front of not just the influential Jewish community, but also the evangelical community, which is also equally important in US politics, particularly from the Republican side. And so it certainly plays well for him. It plays well for Netanyahu because he is embattled as well with the various corruption charges and the trials that have been going on. He had made this announcement that if there is no deal, they would unilaterally annex parts of the West Bank. I personally think that that would have been a non-starter because of the intense opposition that it would have generated within the Arab world, and the Americans were not quite on board with it at this point of time. So it gets him out of a very difficult bind by saying we've suspended or we've the annexation. You know, from an Emirati point of view, they want Trump to stay. They did not like Obama. They did not like Obama doing the nuclear deal without consultation with Emiratis who are sitting next door, and felt that they had been handed a fait accompli. The fact that the Trump administration has taken such a hardline stance on Iran is music for the Emiratis. Definitely, all of this plays into the U.S. political season, and the jury will be out till the second week of November on how effective these developments have been in the context of U.S. politics.
Yeah. Ambassador Suri, how does it really change the Arab world? Because a lot of other Arab countries, for example, Oman or Bahrain, will also probably follow in the footsteps of UAE. We know that there are already some relationships that they've had. They are not so uh, averse to Israel. So this can change things. This can change the geopolitics of West Asia. America, we know, is now no longer the only player there. We see the Russian interest. The Turkish are claiming of new gas fields, and that, of course, brings in a lot of interest in the region. How does this change West Asia, this deal? Will it reinforce the Israeli presence in the region more strongly?
Look, I think it's one of those reason versus emotion, head versus the heart kind of issues, where there's a fairly strong stream of thinking which says that Israel is a reality. You've got to deal with it. You can't wish it away. And there are benefits that accrue from a relationship with Israel, be it in terms of technology, be it in terms of skills, or be it in terms of a more favorable relationship with the United States itself. And the pragmatic leadership of some of the Gulf countries, certainly the UAE, recognizes that. But in other countries, you have the street, which is emotional. And say in Cairo, when you go, while President Sisi has come out welcoming the agreement, I think there will be unhappiness on the street itself, because there's still a significant Arab population which feels connected with the Palestinian cause and feels that they have not had their due, and that agreements like these militate against the support for the Palestinian cause. So I guess if you put it, the realists versus the idealists would say, no, this is not good enough. This is not how it was supposed to be. But we saw last year that Prime Minister Netanyahu made an unannounced visit to Oman when Sultan Qaboos was still around. We saw Bahrain host an international conference for peace and prosperity, which was very much an American-driven conference, and Jared Kushner came. Senior Israeli businessmen and officials came for that particular interaction. So you can kind of read the tea leaves on this, that the trends are there. Each country will probably choose the timing to its advantage, but don't be surprised if over the coming months and years, you do see additional countries recognize that there is nothing to be gained through the ongoing boycott of Israel. It hasn't changed Israel's behavior. It hasn't softened Israel's stance towards the Palestinians. So you might as well start working with Israel and try and create some leverage through a relationship rather than through a boycott.
Yes, like you clearly said, Israel is a reality, and India has had, when we talk of Israel and UAE, India treats both of them as friends. India's ties with the UAE has been quite on the upswing. We know that the IPL is just going to be played there. Like in one of the pieces that you wrote, you talked about how the relationship has blossomed between IPL 2014 and IPL 2020. And we know it's also because of a tremendous outreach by the Modi government. He visited there, and he was the first prime minister to do so in years after Indira Gandhi. But there has also been a very proactive role that UAE has played. So for India, India has welcomed this deal. What's in it for India right now after this deal? How are things going to change?
Look, I see Israel and UAE as India's two strongest friends in the Middle East. Both of them have stood by us when we needed. The Israelis stood by us in terms of defense hardware, technologies, and so on. The Emiratis stood with us politically, whether it was on the OIC, the invitation to Mrs. Sushma Swaraj to be the guest of honor at the OIC Foreign Ministers meet, by their statement that Kashmir was an internal issue of India once Article 370 was abrogated, etc., etc. So we certainly look to these two countries as our two closest friends. And the fact that they are now getting together does create additional opportunities for India going forward. And there's no question that Prime Minister Modi has made a personal investment in these relationships. He has visited UAE 3 times as Prime Minister, which is quite remarkable. He's been awarded UAE's highest civilian award and so on. And he's been the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. But he's balanced it by also being the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Ramallah. And to actually make a visit to Palestine, which is something that many Arab leaders haven't done. So, yeah. For us, the art of diplomacy is really trying to nurture these strong relationships, but without necessarily compromising on the support that we have traditionally provided to the Palestinians. And so we will continue to nuance that, to finesse that. I just want to make one key point that when we look at this dramatic development, there's something else which is happening in UAE, which many people don't take note of. There's the political side of the relationship that they are trying to establish with the Israelis. But there's also the change that is happening in UAE itself, where they are trying to promote this image of themselves as a tolerant society, where they are creating this house of Abrahamic faiths, where a synagogue, a mosque, and a church would be built within the same complex. In Dubai, you've actually got a rabbi now designated to cater to the religious needs of the significant Jewish community. There's even a kosher store that caters to the need. I think we mustn't underestimate the significance of these little things that are happening. And it shows that these are societies in transition. Let's not stay caught up in our own stereotypes of how countries are, and recognize the change that is taking place. And some of that change is manifest in the political dimensions that you see.
Absolutely. That's a very, very important point to note, the changes that are taking place there internally. And we know UAE has always been hard on religious extremism, and it's very keen to bring about changes and be seen as a tolerant society. We also see some of those changes in Saudi Arabia, with the newer generation being more strongly active there, the Prince Salman being more active there. So this is just the beginning. There might be hitches on the way. Thank you so much for the analysis and discussion. This is it for today on this discussion from us.
Thank you, Naghma.
Thank you.